Hi, welcome to this How Do I video on developing .NET components for use in Microsoft Dynamics NAV Managed Service for Partners. This video is a part of the Microsoft Dynamics NAV Managed Service for Partners series. In this video, you'll see how to develop .NET components that can be used by CL code as .NET interoperability component from the managed service tenants. There will be 4 steps to this topic. First, I'll develop a new .NET component using Visual Studio and C#. Then I'll write some CL code that consumes that component. Then I'll prepare the component for deployment, and finally I'll test the deployment and usage from a managed service tenant. Let's get it done. Everything that applies to .NET interoperability on-prem applies to it in managed service. On top of that, your .NET interoperability components should not write to registry, make direct database access, or be persisting any data on the NST file system. I'll first create a new project, then choose Windows class library type, and I'll call it period extension. This will be a very simple component that will allow some simple period calculations by .NET, which will be consumed from CL. It's a good practice to sign your components with a strong name, so go to Project Properties, then access the Signing tab, and then choose to sign the assembly with a new strong name key file. Your .NET assemblies may sometimes reference some third-party .NET components. This is allowed with Managed Service too. In my example, I'll use NuGet Package Manager in Visual Studio to look for the time period library and then install it for my project. I'll now add some code to simplify the calculation whether a posting date is allowed within a period. Normally, it's a good idea to create unit tests for your C# projects, so I'll do the same here. I'll write a simple test method to test my isAllowed function with different input sets and test it. Apparently, it indicates some problems with my original code, so I'll go back to my original class and change the functional code in there, and then rerun the tests to see that the tests now work. Remember, it is always simpler to write test code and have full-scale automated testing inside C#. As long as you can simulate all the inputs CL can generate, it is much simpler to run the tests from tools integrated in Visual Studio than to redeploy the components, restart the service tier, and then run tests from CL. Once my tests succeed in Visual Studio, I'm pretty confident I can now move to the next step. Before I can write my CL code, I must make my .NET component available to the development environment. To do that, I'll open the project folder, then browse to bin, debug, and then copy all the DL files from there. I'll then go to the add-ins folder of my role-tailored client and paste the copied files there. This makes my component available for CL development. In my development environment, in a new code unit, I'll add a new function. I'll make it an event subscriber for table 36 sales header on after validate event for the posting date field. I'll define a new .NET local variable that I'll bind to the assembly and class I just developed and tested in Visual Studio. I'll also create 2 more record variables for the setup records I'll need. Then I'll write some code. I'll retrieve the GL setup and user setup for the current user, and then call into my .NET component to validate whether the posting date for my sales header belongs to an allowed period as defined in both the GL setup and the user setup records. If either checks return false, I show an error informing the user that posting with the chosen date is not allowed. I'll now save my new code unit and I'm ready to deploy the component to the service tier and test it. On Managed Service, you do not have access to the file system, so you cannot deploy your .NET components into the add-ins folder of your NST. Therefore, all .NET components you intend to use must be deployed from the database. To configure that, I'll go to Control Add-ins page, then click New. The name of the new control add-in must match the assembly name of my .NET component. In this case, it is period extension. There are several ways to retrieve a public key token from a .NET assembly, but the simplest is to copy it from your CL variable definition. I'll look it up in my development environment, copy it from there, and then paste it back into my control add-in definition. Then you must make sure that the version field value matches exactly the version of your assembly. In my example, it is 1000. Finally, I'll set the category to .NET interoperability. Then I'll click Import to import the resource file. The resource file for .NET interoperability is a zip file containing your assembly you developed as well as any dependent assemblies you used. I'll go back to my project folder, select my assembly and the third-party assembly it uses, and then create a zip file from them. Then, back in my import assembly dialog, I'll paste this zip file, select it, and then click Open. The name of the zip file does not matter. What matters is that it includes the assembly you created, which must match the name, public key token, and version as specified in the controller in record, as well as any dependent assemblies it references. When you have created the controller in record and imported its resource file, you can now create and deploy a new business logic backpack file to a new application version in the managed service, as explained in the How Do I Create and Upload a SQL Backpack into the Microsoft Dynamics NAV Management Portal video. Once I get new tenant provision from the application version that includes my new CAL changes and .NET component deployed to the application database, I can test my code. In my web client, I'll first configure the General Ledger setup card to allow posting into 1 month period of January 2017. Then I'll create a new sales order to try out a date before the allowed period. This will invoke my event subscriber function, which will attempt to instantiate my .NET component. This will trigger the database deployment, and the NST on the managed service will locate my .NET component in the controller in stable, deploy it from there, and then successfully instantiate and use it, as I can attest from the given error message. I'll try with one more date outside the allowed period to see it fail again. And then I'll try again with a date within the allowed period, which will now be accepted by my logic written in C#. In this video, you have seen how to develop a .NET component inside Visual Studio using C# and how to even use external dependencies for it. For managed service use, there are no further limitations or considerations beyond those that apply to on-prem deployment, except that your C# code should not in any way depend on local file system, registry, or direct database access. Then you have seen how to use the .NET component from CAL and how to configure it for database deployment by the managed service application. Finally, you have tested the component from a managed service tenant to validate that it works just like it would work in an on-prem deployment. In this video, we have covered topics of developing custom logic using Visual Studio in C# and configuring control add-ins and resources for database deployment. To learn more about the Microsoft Dynamics Managed Service for Partners, please visit http://aka.ms/NAV Managed Service. I hope you enjoyed this short video. Thanks for watching, and see you soon in another How Do I video from the Microsoft Dynamics NAV Managed Service for Partners series.